If you've ever been to a psychology course, I know you've heard about these. These are the 4 biggest myths still taught in psychology. We're going to start this week with one of the more gruesome stories taught in psychology courses, the case of Kitty Genovese. This is a story that happened in the 1960s in New York, where a woman was accosted and raped, stabbed, and then left for dead in a New York alleyway. Supposedly around 38 people saw the stabbing in her surrounding apartment buildings, but didn't call 911 because they all thought someone else was doing it for them. It ended up being that Kitty Genovese stayed there, bleeding to death for about 30 minutes. The stabber returned, stabbed her again, and again left. And then once again, nobody called the police. Finally, an unbelievable 3rd time, the stabber comes back in, stabs her, kills her, and then finally someone calls the authorities. Of course, by the time they arrive, it's too late. This story has been used in many psychology courses to highlight something called the bystander effect. It's this idea that if someone needs help, they're actually more likely to get helped the fewer people there are around them. That's because if there's a lot of people around, there's this diffusion of responsibility where no one wants to help because they think someone else will. But this whole account was actually made up by a New York reporter who sensationalized the actual murder of Kitty Genovese. According to actual eyewitness testimony and police record, Kitty Genovese was stabbed on Austin Street in New York City. When it happened though, someone in a nearby apartment building actually went out of their window and yelled at the assailant to get away. The assailant fled the scene and this person then called the police. But Kitty, instead of waiting for police to arrive, clutched her stomach where she'd been stabbed and tried to walk home just a few blocks away. On her way, she ended up in an alleyway where again she happened to meet her attacker, who again stabbed her. But this time also, someone actually came out of the apartment building, shooed off the stabber, and again called the police. The police got there a few minutes later, but it was too late. Kitty eventually died of blood loss. But in the real story of this incident, 2 people saw the stabbing and both tried to help and called police. Very different than the news story that got this whole thing started. This faulty news story got national headlines and got a lot of psychologists thinking if the bystander effect was a real phenomenon. And so a lot of good research did come out of this. However, a recent meta-analysis found that when it comes to emergency situations where someone is clearly in dire need of help, the bystander effect tends not to actually occur. People tend to go out of their way to help others, even in crowded situations, if it's a clear emergency. So that's an example of runaway media twisting a story and making it something that it clearly wasn't. And yet, even though we know the facts, and this is now public knowledge, you still see in many introductory psychology books the story of Kitty Genovese getting stabbed 3 times without anyone calling the police. Our second example is the Hawthorne experiment. If that name rings a bell, it's probably because you've heard of the Hawthorne effect. This is a well-known thing in psychology where people act differently if they know that they're being observed. This name first came from a set of experiments done at the Hawthorne Electric Company, in which some experimenters went in and adjusted different working conditions to see if it had an effect on worker output. As the story goes, the psychologists come into the factory and they start tweaking things a little bit. They turn the lights a little brighter in one part of the factory, they offer some workers breaks, they even offer some people more time off. And everything they do seems to have a positive impact on worker output. But then, after a few years of doing these experiments, the psychologists go home to publish their results, and suddenly worker output falls to baseline levels, even though they've kept all of their changes. So the idea was the workers were probably working harder only because they knew they were being observed. So while this story makes logical sense, and it does offer some good insight in how to properly conduct experiments, the original study was really bad. In fact, it only had a sample of 5 people, and 2 of the people had to be replaced halfway through the study. So really, no conclusions could be drawn from a study of such a small sample. Also, since then, other scientists have come in and re-looked at this original data, and they can find no effects at all. Neither of getting the lights brighter, adding more breaks, or any other manipulation they did, or of worker output going back to baseline levels after the experimenters left. In other words, nothing about this story is actually true. The third myth is one of my favorites. It's that one of our most esteemed psychologists in history, B.F. Skinner, actually conducted experiments on his own daughter. B.F. Skinner is most well known for operant conditioning research, in which he put rats and pigeons and other animals into a device called a Skinner box. This way he could manipulate them, perhaps give them treats or administer electrical jolts to train their behavior. The rumor was that Skinner built one of these boxes for his own daughter, and in fact some images were published in the 1940s from Ladies' Home Journal where they show Skinner's daughter in what looks like a Skinner box. In the 1960s, it was rumored that Skinner's daughter, Deborah Skinner, actually went insane from these experiments, sued her father for childhood endangerment, and then committed suicide. Thankfully, none of this is true at all. In fact, by all accounts, Skinner was a very doting and loving father. What he'd actually built for his daughter Deborah was a self-heating crib. His daughter, through the cold winter nights, was getting so bundled in blankets that she was developing a rash. So Skinner made what is now considered an incubator, where he enclosed a crib in glass and added some heating elements to keep his daughter warm. He thought it was such a good idea, he submitted it himself to Ladies' Home Journal, who published a story about it. And the journal gave this crib a pretty glowing review, but then the editors stuck the headline on it, "Baby in a Box," so that when people passed by the magazine aisle and they saw these pictures with that headline, they just kind of put two and two together and the myth got started from there. And whatever happened to Deborah? Thankfully, she never went crazy, she never committed suicide. In fact, she became a well-known and successful artist in London. Even though Deborah is alive and well, you still see this myth pop up once and again. In fact, in the early 2000s, someone wrote a book about how Deborah was tortured by her father, and she actually had to go to The Guardian to clear things up. In the article, she said that B.F. Skinner was a really devoted and loving father and never once did any experiments on her. This last myth is one even I'm guilty of telling in my psychology courses, at least until I figured out the true story. This is a story I heard when I was an undergraduate student. It's a very famous story about Phineas Gage. This is a guy in the late 1800s who was working on constructing a railroad when, due to a dynamite accident, a railroad spike, this 6 or 7 foot long rod, went through his head, up through his cheek and out through the top of his brain, and removed a big chunk of his prefrontal cortex. As the story goes, Phineas Gage seemed actually very healthy after that. Once they removed the rod and he healed, he seemed to have all of his faculties. He was blind in one eye, but otherwise had good vision, and he could remember himself and everything that had happened in his life. However, from then on, the story gets stranger. Supposedly, his wife and him started quarreling more often. He got drunk a lot more, started cursing at everybody, and eventually got fired from work from getting into fights all the time. As the story goes, Phineas's behavior went off the deep end. He suddenly lost all control over himself and eventually died in a gutter, penniless, a few years later. This story is meant to illustrate how self-control and inhibition are housed primarily in the prefrontal cortex, something we know is true. And actually there have been later cases since Phineas Gage of this exact thing happening to people with prefrontal cortex damage. But actually this account we have of Phineas Gage is a myth, invented by his doctor, John Harlow, in order to sell books about this incident. The real story of Phineas Gage is actually a lot more interesting. He ended up recovering from his accident and actually joined the circus. He went around with the Barnum and Bailey circus as a sideshow act, carrying around his tamping iron with him. After a while, he could no longer get easy money from being a circus sideshow, so he moved to New Hampshire and started working at a stable. Eventually he heard about a gold rush going on in Chile, so he went all the way down to Chile and ended up working as a stable hand and stagecoach driver. He worked there for a total of 7 years, and not one account of him is that he was ever anything but the most nice and upstanding citizen. In fact, he got checked out by 2 other doctors, one in Chile and one from Harvard, and they both said they could detect nothing at all amiss about his personality. Eventually, he moved back up to the United States, settled down in San Francisco, and started farming. A few years after that, he ended up having a seizure which did take his life. But this happened 13 years after that original accident. So by all accounts, Phineas Gage lived a pretty long life after his accident and didn't have any changes in his personality whatsoever. To try to clear up these conflicting reports, neurologist Jack Van Horn in 2012 got a hold of Phineas Gage's skull and tried to figure out exactly what parts of the brain would have been damaged by that tamping rod. They actually found that most of the brain that had been damaged would have been the corpus callosum, the white matter connecting the 2 front halves of the hemispheres, so not actually the prefrontal cortex. And lots of research has shown that you can actually completely remove the corpus callosum from the brain and have very little damage to the person's personality as well as any of their other mental faculties. And yet, even since then, most psychology books that I've read have this mythical version of Phineas Gage in them. I think it's because it makes such an interesting case for how important the prefrontal cortex is, but there are plenty of other case studies that illustrate this that are grounded in science rather than fiction. So those are the top 4 myths still talked about in psychology courses, and now you know the true story behind each one of them.